Alright, YouTube gamers, welcome back to RPG Retro Reviews. In this episode, I'm going to review the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. This is the very first reference work fully dedicated to Dungeon Masters for the Dungeons & Dragons first edition game, and arguably one of the best RPG reference works ever written. Even with its small typesetting and awkward organization, this 238-page, voluminous reference work is still a valuable resource to this day. Some might say that the Dungeon Master's Guide is dated, and indeed the game rules therein are antiquated by today's standards. It is exactly this age that makes it interesting and a useful tome for Dungeon Masters. If one were to consider the campaign milieu to be a tapestry for adventure, then the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide is most definitely the thread by which Dungeon Masters can weave epic fantasy tales. Opening the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide is like lifting the lid on a treasure chest with hidden compartments, because simply skimming through the book will not reveal the hidden gems of advice and campaign inspiration hidden within. Only careful perusal of its pages will the nuggets of knowledge be imparted to the viewer. Thus, it is my intention with this review to touch on some of these hidden resources of wisdom and inspiration, reveal some of the Dungeon Master's Guide hidden secrets, talk about some of its conceits, offer some new perspectives on frequently dismissed sections, and highlight some of the more humorous passages, and discuss why this ancient tome of gaming lore is worthy of your attention, whether you are a 30-year veteran or new to the RPG hobby. So, let's get started, shall we? First, we'll start with a bit of trivia. The cover art for the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide that depicts an Efreet in the mysterious city of Brass confronting a party of adventurers. This piece was done by venerable early D&D artist David C. Sutherland III. On page 2, at the bottom of the forward page, a description is placed, which reads, "The book cover painting shows an encounter between three adventurers and an Efreet on the elemental plane of fire. The fabled city of Brass can be seen floating over a flame-swept sea of oil." Very interesting, right? Interestingly enough, the cover art was redone in 1983 by Jeff Easley, but the original description of Sutherland's work was never removed and continued to describe the original work. One thing to mention about AD&D at this time was that the Dungeon Master's Guide was exclusively the province for the Dungeon Master's eyes alone. Players were heavily discouraged from consulting the secrets therein, as Gary Gygax goes on to say himself in his preface to the rulebook. It reads, "As this book is the exclusive precinct of the DM, you must view any non-DM player possessing it as something less than worthy of honorable death. Peeping players there will undoubtedly be, but they are simply lessening their own enjoyment of the game by taking away some of the sense of wonder that otherwise arises from a game which has rules hidden from its participants. It is in your interest and theirs to discourage possession of this book by players. If any of your participants do read herein, it is suggested that you assess them a heavy fee for consulting sages and other sources of information not normally attainable by the inhabitants of your milieu. If they express knowledge which could only be garnered by consulting these pages, a magic item or two can be taken as payment. Insufficient, but perhaps it will tend to discourage such actions." And indeed, the Dungeon Master's Guide was looked upon with some sense of awe and wonders by players at the time, which really did add to the feel of the game, a game where many rules and mechanics were hidden from the players. What exactly was the DM rolling for behind his screen? Not to mention the massive list of magic items included in this book. But more on that later. Continuing on is Gary's introduction, which has some wonderful advice to DMs to not let the dice and random chance spoil an evening's play. Also, he notes that part of the problem with authoring such a work is deciding exactly what to keep out. Given the immensity of the work that was produced and the small typesetting, one can only imagine what he didn't include here. The next page goes into the use of dice and a rather lengthy discussion on probabilities. This is interesting to be sure, simply because it was understood that the game left much to open to the Dungeon Master's interpretation. And this bit was there to give some perspective to the referee on how to set players' chances of success and so forth. After that, it gets into the various methods of character creation, aging, disease, and death. On page 14, a rather detailed chart is shown describing the diseases and giving a percentage chance of contracting some rather nasty ailments or parasites, and then assigning it a severity. The following page provides a method whereby the DM can secretly determine the character's age upon death. This was actually a pretty important thing because many spells and even traps had the effect of aging a character. Thus, it was possible through the course of a campaign to inadvertently kill a character due to aging. The next few pages discuss various demi-human races such as elves, dwarves, and halflings, and their racial stereotypes. 2 pages are dedicated to followers, how players get them, and random charts for determining exactly who the followers are by race, class, and so forth. Then, all of a sudden, a rather important paragraph on the Paladin's warhorse is presented. It's important to note that the player's handbook, one of the class abilities is at 4th level, the Paladin can summon his warhorse, though no detail is given to the player on how this is done. And here, this important tidbit of information is rather inexplicably just put down. However, it is important to note that the Dungeon Master's Guide has an excellent index, which helps out quite a bit and covers not only the Dungeon Master's Guide, but the player's handbook as well. There is also a very nice section that goes into detail on each of the thieves' abilities and how to referee these abilities. Another aspect of paging through the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide is gaining a perspective on design philosophy of D&D and role-playing in general. On page 21, Gygax goes into some detail on the monster as the player character and the limitations of such a character. Now, I've seen quite a few reviewers, not Gygax, of having the audacity to point out that the game is unashamedly humanocentric. And he writes, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is unquestionably humanocentric, with demi-humans, semi-humans, and humanoids in various orbits around the sun of humanity. Men are the worst monsters, particularly high-level characters such as clerics, fighters, and magic users. Whether singly, in small groups, or in large companies, the ultra-powerful beings of other planes and more fearsome, the 3 Ds of demigods, demons, and devils, are enough to strike fear into most characters, let alone when the very gods themselves are brought into consideration. Yet, there is a point where the well-equipped, high-level party of adventurers can challenge a demon prince, an archdevil, or a demigod. While there might well be some near or part humans with the group so doing, it is certain that the leaders will be human. In cooperation, men bring ruin upon monsterdom, for they have no upper limits, as a level or acquired power from spells or items. The game features humankind for a reason. It is the most logical basis in an illogical game. From a design aspect, it provides the sound groundwork from a standpoint of creating the campaign milieu. It provides the most readily usable assumptions. From a participation approach, it is the only method for all players are, after all is said and done, human, and it allows for them the role with which most are most desirous and capable of identifying with. From all views, then, it is enough fantasy to assume swords and sorcery cosmos with impossible professions and make-believe magic. To adventure amongst the weird is fantasy enough without becoming that too. Consider also that each and every dungeon master worthy of that title is continually at work expanding his or her campaign milieu. The game is not merely a meaningless dungeon and an urban base around which is plopped the dreaded wilderness. Each of you must design a world, piece by piece, as if a jigsaw puzzle were being handcrafted, and each new section must fit perfectly the pattern of the other pieces. Faced with such a task, all of us need all the aid and assistance we can get. Without such help, the sheer magnitude of the task would force most of us to throw up our hands in despair. In a few more paragraphs, he continues, having established the why of human-centric basis of the game, you will certainly see the impossibility of any lasting success for a monster player character. The environment for adventuring will be built around humans and demi-humans for the most part. Similarly, the majority of participants in the campaign will be human. So unless the player desires a character which will lurk alone somewhere and be hunted by adventurers, there is only a few options open to him or her. A gold dragon can assume human shape, so that is a common choice for monster characters. If alignment is stressed, this must discourage the would-be gold dragon. If it is also pointed out that he or she must begin at the lowest possible value, and only time and the accumulation and retention of great masses of wealth will allow any increase in level, the idea should be properly squelched. If even that fails, point out that the natural bent of dragons is certainly for their own kind, if not absolute solitude. So what part could a solitary dragon play in a group participation game made up of non-dragons? Dragon non-player characters, yes. As player characters, not likely at all. And I think that the point Gygax is making here, but due to the complexity of some of his Gygaxian prose, the point has been lost on many. This is not an excuse to restrict the choices of races to players, but in a campaign of humans and human-like people, because let's face it, elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and half-orcs are all human-like, in essence humanoids. How does such a creature fit into the campaign milieu as a whole? How is the player going to justify his existence with the other player characters other than, hey, he's a PC? In addition, such characters tend to dominate the story as he either remains outside most civilized areas or he faces scrutiny and attacks from hostile people in urban areas or superstitious country folk. Such creatures are possible, but what you're talking about here is integrating an entirely new race into your existing campaign milieu, in the way that, say, elves, halflings, dwarfs are integrated into the campaign milieu. In order to justify their existence in the adventure logically, especially if this is a long-standing campaign and the race has not been notable up to this point, where a player wanted to assume such a role. An example of such monster integration into the campaign is the Dragonborn of the 4th edition of the game. As a one-off peculiarity, it might be hard to justify the creature's inclusion in the party of adventurers. But if it's integrated as an entire race, it's certainly more logical. And here, that's exactly what Gygax is trying to say. He's not saying don't do it, but be aware of the pitfalls and the amount of work required in doing so on the part of the DM, and proceed with caution. It's good advice. The next section is a well-done discussion on handling player characters who have been stricken with lycanthropy. Obviously, with weird creatures in the game, this is quite useful. Then there's a lengthy discussion on alignments, which follows lycanthropy. Alignment, lycanthropy. I don't understand the organization either, but did I mention the index is really good? This section also delves into one of the more peculiar aspects of the older editions of the game, alignment languages, and attempts to justify their existence. And I quote, "Alignment language is a handy game tool which is not unjustifiable in real terms. Thieves did employ a special cant. Secret organizations and societies did and do have certain recognition signs, signals, and recognition phrases, possibly special languages of limited extent as well. Consider also the medieval Catholic Church, which used Latin as a common recognition and communications base to cut across national boundaries. In AD&D, alignment languages are the special set of signs, signals, gestures, and words which intelligent creatures use to inform other intelligent creatures of the same alignment of their fellowship and common ethos. Alignment languages are never flaunted in public. They are not used as situations or interrogatives of the speaker is uncertain of the alignment of those addressed. Furthermore, alignment languages are of limited vocabulary and deal with the ethos of the alignment in general, so lengthy discussion of varying subjects cannot be conducted in such tongues." This is all a bit silly, really, and immediately begs the question on how anyone ever speaks these 9 different languages, where they learn them, not to mention what happens when they change alignment. A few paragraphs down it says, Any character foolish enough to announce his or her alignment by publicly crying out in an alignment tongue can incur considerable social sanctions. At best, he or she will be thought unmannerly and rude, boorish and stupid. Those of the same alignment will be inclined to ignore the character, not wishing to embarrass themselves by admitting any familiarity with the offender. Those of other alignments will likewise regard the speaker with distaste when overhearing such an outburst. At worst, the character will be marked by those hostile to the alignment in which he or she spoke. Really, it's all just nonsense. And because of this, many DMs tend to dismiss this concept outright and neglect the implications, which is the various secret societies that might be alignment-based and the secret languages within those organizations. You could have secret organizations for lawful good, such as the Knights Templar, or organizations for the spreading of chaos and evil, such as the fabled Illuminati. Organizations such as this would surely have their own special languages, and the rules for alignment languages certainly make perfect sense in that context. So, as a DM, one might read this and get to thinking about what secret societies exist within their own campaign milieu, what their goals are, who is allowed to join, and who is not. And now you have the basis for some interesting conflict in your stories. Perhaps one of the player characters whose deeds have reached the ears of such a secret society is invited by a member for inclusion. Or perhaps the actions of the PCs have inadvertently run afoul of another, and so on. The possibilities are only limited by imaginations, however, the seeds of which are rooted in this neat little section on alignment languages. Well, that's the end of part 1 of this video. I'm going to continue to review the Dungeon Master's Guide in part 2, and we'll discuss the comprehensive magic item section in the Dungeon Master's Guide and those infamous appendices you may have heard so much about. So, until then, game on.